Hey there, we are now going to analyze those situations on which it is not entirely clear if exchanging is good or not. So whenever you can exchange pieces and the resulting position is as good as the position that you had before exchanging, the question is, should you exchange pieces or not? And this is very often a matter of style. Some players like to exchange many pieces to get positions on which you have fewer pieces that normally, but not always, are quieter positions, whereas other players might prefer to have more tension on the board and positions on which they can press harder for a win. So the reasons for exchanging or not exchanging might be many. Let's analyze some positions to try to understand the ideas behind the exchanges. In this position, that was reached in many games, but we're going to focus on this game between these two former world champions. Here white took on c5. And this idea will invite an exchange of queens, which is what happened in the game. If black takes directly on c5, which is possible, white can also take on d8 and exchange queens. And we get similar positions. White might sooner or later bring the rook to d1. In the game, black took on d1, and after taking on d1, black captured on c5. Now about this exchange that white made, d takes c5, we can talk about pros and cons. Normally a pawn on d4 is very strong because it's on the center. This pawn actually was controlling the e5 square, so it was supporting the knight. Additionally, after taking on c5, black improved the placement of the bishop, that was more passive on f8, so those could be points against that exchange. On the other hand, after black exchanged queens, this rook came to d1, and just to illustrate, here we have a very symmetrical position. White might even play the move a3, which is not necessarily strong, but if white plays the move a3, we get a very symmetrical position. The slight differences are that the king is on g1, black's king is not on g8 but on e8, but white's rook is better placed. The rook is on an open file, so white is at least not worse in this position. We might even say that white is a tiny little bit better. In the game, white didn't play the move a3, white played the move knight b to d2 to develop the knight, but the main point is the position is roughly balanced. It is quieter now because we exchange queens, and an important point is that here white is a player who likes position with fewer pieces, whereas black, who was Garry Kasparov, is a player that normally likes to keep tension on the board and to attack. So here white was mainly playing against the opponent's style. So this is another reason that we might have to exchange more pieces. And in the game, even though the game was a draw, white was pressing for a win throughout the game. So that's why this move d takes e5 is not necessarily strong, but here it is mainly a matter of style, because white has many alternatives to taking on c5. Here white can play many moves in the position. For example, white might play the move queen to e2, white might even plan to bring the rook to d1, and normally with more tension and more pieces on the board, we might get more wins and losses rather than draws. And by the way, in this case, after d takes e5, black could have tried to avoid the exchange of queens, but in this particular position, it is a bit hard to do that because white has captured a pawn, so white might even plan to defend it later. But black could have played a move like queen to a5, but again, this would try to avoid the exchange of queens, would be more ambitious to keep more tension on the board. But in this case, it would not be very strong because black would waste time to get that pawn back, and this queen can be attacked sooner or later either by the bishop, or if it captures the pawn on c5, a rook might come to c1 to attack it. So here black would try to avoid the exchange of queens, but black would waste time doing that, so this would also be risky for black. Let's analyze another interesting position on which exchanging is interesting but not necessarily strong. Here we have an imbalance. Black has two bishops for a bishop and a knight, but on the other hand, black has this isolated pawn on c6 that might be a target. There's also this interesting point that white's king cannot castle because it's already on d1, whereas black can castle. And in this position, black took the knight on c3. And as we'll see, this will lead to a quieter position, to a more drawish position. An interesting try was to castle short. So black wants to keep these two bishops that are very active. And although white might try, for example, to play knight to a4 to attack this pawn, black might give a check, and the king doesn't have a lot of good squares. It cannot go to f2 because bishop to f5 is a very nice checkmate. Playing bishop to d2 to stop the check looks fairly passive. That's why white might try to play the move king to e1 and try to bring the king back to f2 in order to connect the rooks. So this is a position which is fairly tense. Black has some advantages, but also white has some advantages. This knight will come to c5. White is trying to attack this pawn, which by the way this pawn cannot be taken straight away because after the move bishop to d5, black would attack on c6 and the rook on h1. But in any case, white's idea is to put some pressure on that pawn. So here both sides have advantages and disadvantages, and the position is fairly complicated. Instead here black took the knight on c3, which simplifies the game a lot. First of all, we now have less pieces on the board. We could say that this exchange, if we consider the pieces that were exchanged, is not very good because black gave this bishop on g7 that was very powerful. But on the other hand, white's knight was also very strong because it was planning to come to c5. But another point in favor of that exchange is that now white will not have a lot of pressure on this pawn. Black can defend it with the bishop and it will be very hard to attack it. So here we have bishop of different colors, we have opposite color bishops. It is very hard to attack this pawn on c6 after black defends it with the bishop. And these positions with opposite color bishops, if we removed all the rooks, so we will get this position, this would be a fairly easy draw. Here black can simply play the move a6, and as we can see, white cannot attack black's pawns. Most of the pawns are on light squares. White has a dark square bishop, so it's very hard for any side to make a lot of progress in this position, so this is normally an easy draw. But in the game we still have rooks on the board, so with rooks on the board the position is still more complex. Objectively it is roughly equal, so exchanging rooks here in this position would also be a matter of style because it wouldn't change the equality, but it would give even less winning chances in the position. So in any case, I want to highlight the point that in both positions, going for the exchange or not going for the exchange would simply lead to different positions, but not necessarily to better positions. So on positions where trading is neither good or bad, then exchanging can be a matter of style. On the other hand, do not exchange or avoid exchanges by prioritizing your style over the objective evaluation of an exchange. So if you like to play with fewer pieces on the board, do not exchange because of that, but only exchange if those exchanges are justified.